Here is an uncomfortable truth most men spend their lives avoiding. The majority will never build real wealth, not because opportunity doesn't exist, not because the system is impenetrable, but because their psychology quietly makes it impossible. Few men are willing to hear this. Wealth is not withheld from most people. It simply exposes them. It reveals impatience. It magnifies insecurity. It punishes emotional volatility. And most never realize they disqualified themselves years ago, not through a single failure, but through patterns of thinking that felt harmless at the time. The cost is greater than it appears. This is not about shaming the average man. It is about understanding the hidden architecture of failure, the unconscious habits, the short-term impulses, the need for validation, the fear of standing apart. These fractures remain invisible until pressure is applied. Wealth is pressure, and when pressure arrives, character is audited. If that idea creates resistance, pay attention to it, because the real barrier has never been external. It has always been structural, and structure begins in the mind. The first instinct when confronting wealth disparity is to look outward. The economy is broken. Rich people are lucky. You need connections. It's all corruption. These explanations carry fragments of truth. Systems are imperfect. Networks matter. Luck exists. But none of these fully explain why so few sustain wealth once it arrives. Because here is the deeper layer most men avoid. Even if handed significant money tomorrow, the majority would slowly return to their baseline. Not because they are incapable, but because their internal structure cannot hold it. We live in an age engineered for short-term dopamine, constant stimulation, endless scrolling, immediate consumption. The nervous system becomes conditioned to novelty, not patience. Wealth, however, compounds in silence. It grows through repetition, boredom, and delayed gratification. Few men train for that. Then there is the status loop. Comparison becomes a daily ritual. Identity is outsourced to visible symbols, cars, watches, lifestyle signals. Money becomes a tool for ego reassurance rather than capital allocation. Emotional spending replaces strategic investing. Validation replaces vision. Add to this the fear of exclusion. To think differently about money often means behaving differently. Saving while others spend. Investing while others indulge. Working while others relax. Most men underestimate how uncomfortable social independence feels. Belonging is powerful, can quietly override ambition. And perhaps most damaging is the inability to tolerate boredom. Real wealth is built in seasons that look uneventful from the outside. The disciplined mind can endure monotony without self-sabotage. The impulsive mind seeks stimulation and calls it freedom. So yes, external limitations exist, but the more decisive limitation is internal architecture. Wealth requires long-term thinking when others demand immediacy. Emotional neutrality when markets fluctuate. Strategic patience when progress appears invisible. And social independence when conformity feels safer. The impulsive mind reacts. The disciplined mind positions. One seeks relief, the other builds capacity. This is where ownership begins, not by denying external challenges, but by recognizing that without psychological sovereignty, opportunity is irrelevant. And most never realize that the real economy they needed to master was internal. If the internal economy is decisive, then we have to examine what it is conditioned by. Modern life does not train men for discipline. It trains them for stimulation. Constant notifications, infinite feeds, short-form entertainment engineered to compress excitement into seconds. Social media comparison that turns every achievement into a public scoreboard. Consumption has become frictionless. Pleasure is immediate, portable, and endless. Over time, the nervous system adapts. Baseline attention shortens. Patience feels unnatural. Silence becomes uncomfortable. The mind begins to crave spikes of validation, novelty, distraction. This is not weakness. It is conditioning. But conditioning, left unexamined, becomes destiny. Wealth operates on a different timeline. It demands years without visible reward, repetition without applause, effort that appears ordinary from the outside. Few men are prepared for that kind of obscurity. They want visible progress. They want external confirmation that they are moving forward. When it doesn't arrive quickly, doubt fills the gap. The modern environment whispers, optimize for pleasure. Real wealth requires optimizing for durability. Consider the contrast. Impulse says, I deserve comfort now. I've worked hard enough. Discipline says, comfort is earned through structure. Impulse chases relief from boredom. Discipline tolerates boredom as part of the process. Impulse seeks applause. Discipline builds competence. Most men are not financially limited because they lack intelligence. Information has never been more accessible. Opportunities have never been more visible. The deeper issue is regulation. Can you sustain focus when there is no external reward? Can you restrain spending when status is tempting? Can you remain steady when progress feels slow? Nervous system instability masquerades as impatience. Impatience becomes inconsistent action. Inconsistency prevents compounding. And without compounding, wealth remains theoretical. Few men understand that the battle is physiological before it is financial. If you cannot govern your attention, your impulses, your need for stimulation, you will default to what feels good in the moment. And what feels good in the moment rarely compounds. This is where self-sabotage becomes invisible. It doesn't look dramatic. It looks normal. And that is precisely why it is so dangerous. Beyond stimulation and impulse lies something deeper. The fear of separation. Wealth at its core separates, not morally, not spiritually, but behaviorally. And human beings evolved to avoid separation at almost any cost. For most of history, exclusion meant danger. To be cast out from the tribe was to lose protection, identity, and survival. That wiring still exists, which means when a man begins to think differently about money, when he saves aggressively, invests patiently, declines social spending, or prioritizes long-term positioning over short-term enjoyment, he risks subtle exclusion. He becomes different, and difference creates tension. Wealth building often requires outgrowing your environment, not with arrogance, but with divergence. You read when others scroll. You build when others unwind. You delay when others indulge. Few decisions are dramatic on their own, but over time the gap widens. Many men subconsciously sabotage this process to preserve belonging. They downplay ambition so they don't seem obsessed. They mock extreme discipline to signal they are still relatable. They avoid calculated risks because visible failure invites judgment. They keep themselves within the acceptable range of their social circle. Most men fear isolation more than poverty. The price of wealth is often social friction. It is easier to remain average with approval than to advance with resistance. Easier to complain collectively than to position independently. And modern culture amplifies this pressure. Conformity is rewarded. Consumption is celebrated. Sovereignty is quietly discouraged. To pursue meaningful wealth requires individuation. It demands that a man anchor his identity internally rather than socially. That shift is psychological before it is financial. Because once you no longer require consensus to act, your decisions change. Few men recognize that their ceiling is not imposed by policy or markets, but by the invisible boundary of what their environment considers acceptable. And crossing that boundary feels uncomfortable long before it becomes profitable. This is where the struggle deepens, not between rich and poor, but between belonging and becoming. When these patterns remain unexamined, the consequences are rarely dramatic. There is no sudden collapse, no single catastrophic decision. Instead, there is erosion. Over 10 or 20 years of unconscious living, the average man becomes financially fragile. He earns, he spends, he adjusts, but he never builds meaningful margin. One disruption, a recession, a layoff, an unexpected expense, creates disproportionate stress. Stability always feels temporary. Chronic stress becomes normal. Not visible panic, but a low-grade pressure that never fully disappears. Quiet resentment follows. He watches others advance and tells himself stories about luck, corruption, or unfair advantage. Envy disguises itself as criticism. Emotional volatility increases, especially around money, status, and comparison. The deeper damage is identity erosion. When responsibility feels heavy, blaming the system feels relieving. Cynicism becomes a shield. "It's all rigged" sounds intelligent, but often functions as self-protection. Ambition shrinks to match comfort. Goals become smaller, safer, less demanding. Over time, a man who once imagined expansion begins negotiating with limitation. The trajectory compounds quietly. At a societal level, this pattern scales. Dependence on institutions increases because individual resilience declines. Self-reliance becomes rare enough to appear extreme. Mediocrity normalizes itself through repetition. Discipline looks obsessive. Long-term thinking looks unrealistic. And the culture adjusts downward. This is not a dramatic downfall. It is gradual diminishment. A man does not wake up one day defeated. He adapts slowly to less risk, less ownership, less sovereignty, until the gap between what he could have become and what he settled for becomes too uncomfortable to examine. Few men notice this happening in real time. That is what makes it dangerous. Before going further, slow down. Strip away the market, the economy, the opinions, the comparisons. Remove the abstractions. What remains is you, your habits, your tolerance, your thresholds. Can you sit alone without stimulation? Not for minutes, but for hours. Without reaching for a screen. Without seeking noise to fill the silence. Can you work for years without applause? Without public recognition? Without visible proof that others approve of your direction? Can you watch others celebrate while you build quietly? Can you endure being misunderstood, labeled obsessive, intense, distant, while you remain committed to a longer horizon? Can you delay validation? Not suppress desire, but discipline it. Not eliminate ambition, but anchor it internally rather than socially. These are not rhetorical questions. They are diagnostic. If you felt resistance to these questions, that resistance is information. It reveals where impulse still governs, where approval still anchors identity, where comfort still negotiates with ambition. Wealth, in its most stable form, is less about earning money and more about becoming the man who can carry responsibility without collapsing under it. Money amplifies who you already are. If you require constant reassurance, pressure will expose it. If you lack internal structure, expansion will destabilize you. Few men are willing to measure themselves honestly. And without that measurement, nothing fundamental changes. Up to this point, the diagnosis may feel heavy. But diagnosis without agency becomes another form of paralysis. So the pivot is necessary. Instead of asking, "Why them?" ask, "Who must I become?" That question shifts the axis of control. It moves you from spectator to architect. Wealth is rarely the direct result of desire. It is a byproduct of structure. Structure is a byproduct of discipline. And discipline is a byproduct of identity. If you see yourself as reactive, you will react. If you see yourself as sovereign, you will organize your life accordingly. Psychological sovereignty is not dramatic. It is precise. It is regulating emotion when markets fluctuate or opportunities collapse. It is directing attention toward what compounds rather than what entertains. It is governing impulses when status tempts you to spend. It is choosing long-term positioning over short-term relief, repeatedly, until it becomes automatic. This is where fear transforms. Isolation becomes strategic focus. You are not alone because you are rejected. You are alone because you are building. Delay becomes investment. Time without visible reward becomes leverage. Discomfort becomes training, strengthening your capacity to withstand pressure without fragmentation. Envy dissolves when responsibility solidifies. You stop presenting outcomes and start reverse engineering them. You stop analyzing personalities and start refining patterns. You realize that wealth, in its durable form, follows men who can remain steady under expansion. The path is not closed. It is narrow, and narrow paths require intention. They require fewer distractions, fewer emotional swings, fewer negotiations with comfort. but they remain available to anyone willing to adjust their identity before demanding external change. This is the moment most men retreat, not because it is impossible, but because it is exacting. Yet for the man willing to accept that standard, something shifts. The struggle becomes structured, and structure creates momentum. If sovereignty is the pivot, integration is the proof. Begin with nervous system discipline. Reduce overstimulation deliberately. Limit unnecessary digital input. Create windows of silence. Schedule boredom instead of escaping it. When you train yourself to sit without spikes of dopamine, you strengthen the very circuitry required for long-term focus. A regulated nervous system is an economic advantage. Next, design your environment with intention. Remove subtle consumption triggers, apps, notifications, habitual spending routes. Build a workspace that signals depth rather than distraction. Audit your social influences without resentment but with honesty. If your environment normalizes impulsive living, you will constantly swim against the current. Structure reduces friction. Expand your time horizon. Think in 5- and 10-year arcs rather than weekly outcomes. Install a weekly review ritual to evaluate decisions, not emotions. Practice delayed reward training in small ways. Postpone purchases, extend timelines, reinvest gains. Compounding favors the patient, but patience must be practiced. Strengthen emotional regulation. Learn to respond neutrally to both wins and losses. Euphoria destabilizes as easily as panic. Keep structured reflection through journaling, not as therapy, but as calibration. Acknowledge your shadow, envy, greed, insecurity without denial. What you refuse to see will quietly direct your decisions. Finally, shift identity language. Stop saying, "I want to be rich." Desire is passive. Instead say, "I am building capacity." Capacity implies responsibility, resilience, and structure. It centers the man, not the money. Understand this clearly. Money is a magnifier. If you lack discipline, it amplifies chaos. If you lack emotional control, it intensifies instability. Wealth does not fix character. It reveals it. Rich is not income. Rich is psychological stability under pressure. When pressure increases and you remain composed, structured, and deliberate, you are already operating differently than the majority. And difference, sustained over time, compounds. Return to the original premise. 97.1% will never become truly wealthy, not because they lack intelligence, not because opportunity is extinct, but because they will not restructure themselves deeply enough to sustain expansion. Wealth is not rare because possibility is rare. It is rare because disciplined identity is rare. The divide is not primarily economic. It is psychological. You are not competing against other men. You are competing against your own impulses, against your need for comfort, against your appetite for validation, against the subtle drift toward distraction and conformity. Few men recognize this. Fewer accept it. If you master your impulses, expand your time horizon, and accept the solitude of discipline, you separate yourself, not through aggression, not through noise, but through structure. There is no guarantee attached to that path. Only probability, probability shaped by identity. The decision, then, is simple but demanding. Remain conditioned or become sovereign. Beyond the struggle, where discipline replaces impulse, and clarity replaces chaos.